Hello everybody, ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow travelers. We are incredibly excited to welcome tonight Haim, Martino and Alice for this trialogue. I just want to say a few things about the exhibition. It's for Julia Peyton-Johns and me and our entire teams a dream come true that these two exhibitions could open this week. Two super different exhibitions, an exhibition of art at the Serpentine Gallery and an exhibition of design at the Serpentine Gallery, yet they are connected in many different ways. And it was actually some time ago that I kept always quoting Lawrence Weiner, who said, books do furnish a room. And then one day, Alice Rawsthorn pointed out to me that actually Lawrence got the quote from Anthony Powell, who said, books do furnish a room. So here we can say today, shelves do furnish a room. Martino found a better quote, no shelf, no collector. The two exhibitions both have in common also that they have a rule of the game. Haim Steinbach show once again the world is flat, and Martino show design is a state of mind. Both of these exhibitions are traveling shows who somehow evolve and change wherever they go. In Haim's exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery, there are many layers because it's on the one hand a survey of his amazing inventions, of his many epiphanies. You can see all the stations of his work in the show. Yet at the same time, it's also a group show, which shows his amazing vision as a curator. And then there is a whole other aspect, which is actually him bringing in different collections and also making it, since his very early work that plays a role, very participatory, because many, many people were invited to actually contribute these salt and pepper elements which become part of the collection. In a similar way, Martino's exhibition from the very beginning had a rule of the game. We had discussions when we invited Martino first about chairs, and then chairs became shelves. And the idea was really that the shelf would become a kind of a display feature which would run throughout the exhibition, would become a kind of an infinite shelf of many different shelves. And that almost like in a Russian matryoshka kind of way, the exhibition could hide many other exhibitions. A show always can hide another show. So both of these exhibitions are institutional collaborations. Haim's exhibition is a close collaboration with the CCS Bad Hessel Museum of Art and will then go after London to the Kunsthalle in Zurich. And Martino's exhibition is a collaboration with the Pinacoteca Agnelli in Torino, the Pinacoteca with Ginevra Elkan, and also the museum in Bolzano. I would like to dedicate tonight's talks to the memory of Alain Resnais, who died last week, age 91, and obviously for Martino, one of the very important things is this film, Le Jean du Styrène from 1958, whom he actually put into the exhibition. We are incredibly thrilled that Alice agreed tonight to moderate this conversation. Alice has a marvelous essay in Martino's catalogue. It's entitled, Sometimes Design Should Come from the Stomach. Alice is a writer on design for the International New York Times, which syndicates her columns worldwide. She's a key advisor in all of the Serpentine's forays into design since the very, very beginning, also with the Marathon. And Alice, as of very recently, is also a columnist of design for Frieze magazine. And last but not least, she is the author of a book. Those of you who haven't read it, it's extremely urgent. It's a very urgent book called Hello World, Where Design Meets Life. And this book will actually be launched tomorrow afternoon in New York. So it's a miracle that Alice could be here today. What is also interesting is that this book was actually published by Hamish Hamilton, and the editor, Simon Prosser, as we will hear later, is one of the lenders to the exhibition with his extraordinary book collection. A very, very warm welcome to Alice, to Haim, to Martino.
Thank you very much, Hans-Ulrich. Well, it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here this evening, and I feel very, very lucky and very privileged to be able to talk to not one artist about their new exhibition, which is always a treat, but two. And as Hans-Ulrich explained, although clearly there are very clear differences and distinctions between Martino's practice and Haim's, there are also many parallels, and so that was why Hans-Ulrich and Julia and their team felt it would be interesting to have a conversation between both artists, or as I should say, the the artist and the designer-maker as the subjects of their exhibitions. And so later we'll be discussing the underlying themes that they share in common, our changing relationship to objects, to collecting, and also to the display and selection of objects, to interdisciplinarity, which is an important theme in both their work, and also the different ways in which objects are interpreted by all of us. I'm going to begin by speaking to each of them individually about their exhibitions. Obviously, most of you will have had a chance to see Martino's exhibition, if not at the opening last night, this evening before you came in. I'm sure many of you saw Haim's exhibition at the opening last night, or maybe today, but I'll ask him to describe the show for those of you who haven't. So after I've spoken to each of them, we'll have a general discussion, and you'll then have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to begin with Haim, and all I can say is that ever since the news of this conversation broke, I have been inundated by artists, designers, writers, filmmakers, practitioners from every discipline who have come up and said, ooh, how fantastic. Haim Steinbach was an enormous influence on me and continues to be. So there have been lots of people in London who've been waiting very anxiously and enthusiastically for your show. So it's wonderful to have it here. And Haim, a little bit of background, he was born in Israel in 1944, but went to live in the United States in 1957. He started out as a minimalist painter, but during the mid-1970s started to explore the selection and arrangement of objects and staged a very famous landmark exhibition at Artist Space in New York in 1979, in which he really experimented with the display of objects, helped, I think, in part by the receptionist at Artist Space at the time, Cindy Sherman. He has since shown with major institutions all over the world and at many important festivals and biennials, notably including Documenta 9 in 1992, where he did an installation of the objects collected by the director, the late Jan Hurt. So Haim has had an extraordinary career. We're very lucky to have his exhibition in London. So Haim, I'm going to start by inviting you to really describe the exhibition, how it came about, and how you've organised it.
Well, that's a big question. So how did it come about? Well, that's Tom Eccles, who proposed to me to do a show at the National Museum at Bard College. He's the one who started the show, in a sense, by offering me a show. And I was at first hesitant for a range of reasons. And then I said to him, okay, here's what I propose. I would like to, do a show that starts with the works that I did in the early 70s, that for me are like the blueprint for my work. So the works in the early 70s were paintings that were in discourse with minimal art and conceptual art. Well, the question, in terms of, for instance, the dictate of Donald Judd, specific objects. So why is it that Donald Judd was not using specific objects in his work? Well, for him, specific objects were more related to material, like the plywood, or the plates, the aluminum plates, but specific object was actually accurate because, for instance, for Andre, the specific object was a grid of plates on the floor that was put in a room in a museum, and people came in and there was nothing on the walls, and they said, "Where is the art?" Somebody was standing on it, and in fact, you could. So, for Andre, the specific object was actually the individual who is standing on the plate. They're on stage, in a sense. They are on the ground. So let's get back to, so the early paintings that I did basically had to do with the placement of pieces, and the pieces were rectangular bars. And they ended up being peripherally on a square canvas. It was like an object. It was sprayed one color. It was finished, a smooth surface. So once you go there, you go, how does that function as an object? Well, it goes maybe above a sofa, if people call it a painting, and it's there's a lamp on the side on the adjacent table, the setting, and there's a coffee table and there's a rug and so on. So that led to the question of surface, and at a certain point I did two things. I began to think about the game board, and I used particle boards that were all the same size, about 2 feet by 2 feet in size, and I placed small little geometrical shapes around. That was just a way of moving the pieces. And then I said, well, the next thing came to, again, material, a specific object, what it is. Getting back to Andre, the floor. So the floor could also be parquet, or it could be Italian ceramic tiles or whatever. So then I found that I could find all that stuff in the linoleum store, where I could find a different cultural material. And so that became the surface for the painting. And then the objects were another series of, let's say, squares, tiles placed around. Once you go from there, you move on to objects and cultural, again, cultural material. So this is what I proposed to Tom, basically to set out the trajectory of the evolution of the work, the discourse in the work, which I felt that the critical establishment for 20 years totally missed, because basically what the critical establishment is interested in is the moment when you surface, right? The moment when suddenly people say, oh, that's interesting, and they begin to talk and argue about it and so on, and they come with terms. Commodity art, simulation, all these things, because they see a group of works that came out of the other works, that are in discourse with the other works, that are concurrent with other practices, but that's the work that the consensus wants to talk about, It creates a kind of a distorted view of the practice. So the idea was to lay out the practice, which deals with architecture, with space. A shelf is a piece of architecture, so is a chair, then you have the wall, then you have the floor, then you have the building, and so on. And that brings in issues of culture and social relations and rituals of everyday, and etc. So basically, that's where the show started, to set the trajectory of the practice, and to see if there's a way to organize it in such a way that it would, lay out the landscape of what the practice is about.
And you also asked the curators of other institutions to propose objects for the exhibition. Can you talk about that?
Well, once the show, for instance, in Artist Space, which was titled Display Number 7, because towards the end of the 80s, I began to use wallpapers. If I had flooring material on the so-called square objects, which somebody would say, oh, it's a painting, but it's not a painting, but then there's the minimal discourse, so it's like a minimal object, and so on. Then the question is, it's on the wall, and what's the wall? Oh, well, the wall is white, right? We have white walls. It's neutral. But it's not neutral, it's a cultural wall. For instance, for the Eskimos, white, there are many, many words for white, because there are all kinds of whites that they see in the white. So what happened is that when I did the show at Artist Space, I asked friends to give me objects for the show. And I also got objects from, some from my parents, some from another friend's parents, because I went to the house and said, could I have that? Could I have that? And so all the objects in that display number 7 were borrowed objects from people. And so that gets into the question of collecting, collections, because a home, a room, the way things are organized, the selection of the objects, right? We go and we say, oh, that's not a good pot. Or that's not a nice, it's a good pot, but it doesn't look good, I prefer that pot, I want that. And so we make choices all the time. And so whether it's the kitchen or the living room, then we also separate them. Things in the kitchen are not in the living room and so on. So the issue was to kind of break these codified boundaries and to, and at the same time, to engage any kind of object. So in a sense, I'm no longer an artist who selects specific things that are within my philosophy of aesthetics, but I am kind of take a step back and I'm kind of an interlocutor or almost like a broker, who brings things together that normally would not be together. And so that, anyway, but once again, then that brings in the question of collections. What is a collection? And then language. What is language? Because language flows beyond collections. Because when we see something we like in somebody's house and their collection and their setting, next time we are in the store and we notice it, say, oh, I want that one. I was looking for that one. And then it comes into our space. And so it's another kind of, it's not the same collection anymore. It's not the same language. It's not the same way of communicating with objects.
So as you've explained in the Artist Space exhibition, it was your friends who were giving objects that were very personal to them. What for you are the distinguishing factors between those kind of objects, which are personal choices by the people who own them, and the selection of objects by curators who work for particular institutions whose predecessors years or decades ago may have actually acquired those objects, and they're likelier to propose the objects from a perspective of knowledge rather than sentiment and ownership. What difference does this make within the exhibition?
Oh, I'm sorry, can you, I lost you for a second.
I'm wondering what distinction you make between objects that are proposed to you by individuals who will probably own those objects and may well have emotional or sentimental associations with them, and the objects that are proposed by curators who work for institutions. For example, a curator from the Victoria and Albert Museum's Museum of Childhood proposed some of the objects that you're showing in the Serpentine exhibition. What for you are the distinctions within your work in terms of the source of those objects?
No difference, no distinctions. It's just another, it's just things coming from another collection. So they have their histories, they have institutional histories, they have their own identities. When we see a work from the Whitworth Museum of a painting from the 19th century that's framed in big, heavy gilded frame, we already identify that to some extent. That's assuming we have some familiarity. We live in this world, and so we do have that familiarity. And the distinction is really what it's going to be next. So it's not the distinction that, oh, this is a historical work. Curators are considering it in terms of its time period and other things from that time period. And they put it in that particular room of that time period. It's history in flux, it's really the way these things talk to me. Of course, I make choices, and not always. For instance, the salt and pepper shakers were chosen by the people who sent them. And when they were placed on the glass shelves, they were placed by Haim Steinbach, one of the curators at the Serpentine Gallery. I said, well, how do you want to place them? I said, you just take them out of the box as they come, and then, put them. And so there's the question of, so there's somebody else who is making, and I said, so basically that's what she did, which would be different than laying them all out and making a choice, what should go with what, and so on.
And why salt and pepper shakers? Of all the specific typology of objects you could have chosen, why did you pick them?
Well, everyone in our culture has them. They are on the table, they're on the kitchen table. But, you know, this does not come out because of that kind of intellectualizing. It actually came out of a show I did a year ago at Roma Gallery in Milan, and I did works that were commissions. So she approached collectors who might be interested, if they were interested in having a work of mine with their objects, and I said, okay, if they are, ask them to choose 15 objects, and from those I will select the ones for the piece from those 15. And she sent me some photographs in the houses of collectors, meeting them and looking at things. And one collector opened the cabinet, and she had all kinds of small ceramic objects, kind of popular cultural figures. And many of them were salt and pepper shakers. So as we were installing the show, I had, well, before I planned to have, at a certain point I decided, why don't we ask each one of the collectors who has a work in the show to offer a pair of salt and pepper shakers or something else, you know, that's related. And so it was not exclusively salt and pepper shakers, but there were quite a number of those. And so it all came from seeing this one collector opening her cabinet and putting all these things on the table. And then later on I met this collector, and I asked her about these objects, and she said, well, they are now in a cabinet because she was she's an editor, and she has a publishing company, and she's quite a member of a kind of a educated, sophisticated society. So she said that when they lived in the old house, they had a certain kitchen with a dining room that was set differently. So she had some of these things there, you know. But in the new house that they moved into, it didn't work anymore. It was, you know, it was too public, you know, in terms of. So she put them in the closet. And all these people have stories, and some people send us notes, you know, telling story about the salt and pepper shaker. These things come about organically. So the work comes about organically. It comes out organically the way that a painter has the tubes of paint, mixes the paint, and begins to make the painting. At that point in time in this painter's history, painter has maybe established a style or a point of view or philosophy, and going to make a new work is like a master pianist getting on the keys and beginning to play the sonata and intuitively, you know, interpreting it. So, you know, it gets to a point where this material for me is like the material that a poet would use, words, you know, and hearing a word. Saint-Saëns was hearing sounds of cars in the street and went back to his piano and began to compose music. John Cage loosened things up quite a bit, and a glass fell or something like this, and it becomes part of the composition, the sound. So, it also has to do with the philosophy, how you look at what your material is, and what language is, and what how you then and what it means in terms of putting it out in the world and writing a story or making a poem or composing a piece of music.
Well, that was beautifully put. Thank you. Now, Martino, who was born in the South Tyrol, he originally apprenticed as a cabinet maker, but then went to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, initially to study sculpture, but switched to industrial design. He worked in commercial design in Milan for a couple of years, but then resumed his studies and came to live in London in 1997 to study at the Royal College of Art, where he studied on the design products course and returned to making furniture and started to use his original cabinet making skills to make as well as design his work, which was relatively unusual for a product designer at the time. He then developed his practice in London, designing and making and occasionally selling work, curating lots of exhibitions with friends, also putting on epic meals. I was lucky enough to sample several of them, in which he'd not only invent the recipes, but also lots of the cooking kit, the crockery, the furniture, and so on, tables like this. And he has continued to exhibit his work, but on an increasingly ambitious scale. And at a time when a lot of cliched nonsense is talked about the division between art and design and craft, one of the things that I hugely admire and also enjoy about Martino's work is that he just gets on with it. And if you intellectualize about his work, you would talk about him crossing the boundaries between all three areas. But I think he does it with great grace and elegance and very successfully because it is so instinctive. And as you will see from the examples of his work in the exhibition, his work can look rather unkempt and rough-hewn, very raw at times, but it always has an amazing formal gutsiness and character. It's very vibrant, very spontaneous, because that's the way he likes to produce it. And he has gathered around his studio in Hackney a sort of an elastic cast of collaborators from many different disciplines, many of whom he's worked with for many years. So his personal interests are very much integrated within his professional practice, and all of that is evident in the exhibition. So can you talk again about how the exhibition came about and how you conceived it?
Thanks for that. So when I was asked to create the show, obviously I did kind of initially ask Julia and Hans Ulrich how come the designers create shows at the Serpentine. Constantine on the first one, 4 years ago?
4 years ago, yeah.
And the artists do the shows. What is the difference between this distinction? And in one of the conversations, Hans Ulrich and Julia said their interest was to have a conversation. So it wasn't basically purely about my work, but it was about how I think, what I'm interested in, and about this dialogue. And I think I'm very grateful that I was able to create a show rather than purely showing my work. And I think what Haim said as well, I think it's these cultural relationships that I'm very much interested always in terms of furniture, in terms of design, because the chair by itself, the table by itself doesn't mean too much to myself, and I don't think it doesn't mean anything to people as well. Because a lot of times design is shown in a very much kind of austere, white space, somehow mimicking also fine art. You have a furniture showroom, it feels sometimes kind of a fake kind of environment, or sometimes it's just a white space and there's a table, a chair. So it's something I always kind of try to avoid in my work, because for me it was much more about, as you mentioned, be it a food event where in order to do food you need a table, in order to eat food you need crockery. So it's about enlarging somehow what you do as an applied artist in that sense. You try to engage with all those different parts that form somehow our everyday life and also culture. So for me, this show was somehow bringing again these different layers together of, I would also call it like a certain plurality in a way that design can be shown, design can be talked about. So I wanted to use existing shelvings as kind of manifest of what historically was done, and then display design or objects that have been designed, been made, been collected by people who are designers or publishers or people who engage in culture.
And why did you choose the shelving? Because, as we can see by looking around, it does tell the sort of potted history of furniture design. I think the oldest is from the 1930s. That's a Gerald Summers piece from what would now be a completely illegal type of exotic wood. Obviously, all the way through to bog standard IKEA shelving and new pieces that you've made. But why choose shelving units? They're a relatively unusual choice for a design exhibition.
There's several reasons. One of them was that I initially wanted to do something with chairs. Chairs is something that's been very much part of my work always. I'm collecting chairs in that sense. I'm remaking them. I'm designing new ones. I'm making new ones. Again, chairs is this kind of uniform and kind of currency in terms of in design. Like that's
uniform currency being a polite way of saying cliché.
Cliché, yeah. But I wanted those chairs to be used by people. I wanted people to sit on them, and we didn't have that much time. We had about 3 months of the show, with Christmas in between. So
it was very difficult to actually get chairs that we could borrow and we could use, because a lot of chairs that you find in collections, be it museums, other places, even private collectors, they wouldn't allow us to sit in them. So at that point I realized it would have been a very kind of static show, it would be something that, chairs by himself, not used, kind of defies the point somehow. So I was looking for other ways that I could create a kind of a relationship. And for me, the shelving, in a way, it's kind of, as Hans Ulrich said, no shelf, no collection. If you have nothing to show on, how are you going to display something? So the idea came that either I designed the show, the display, system, or I find something that obviously talks about design in a similar way. So for me, this at one point this double kind of layer, and where I wanted to show the shelvings as historic and contemporary kind of a manifestation of what design was out there, but at the same time also kind of put them in the background, and they're just there to hold objects and collections of people that I know, all of them, people that I worked with, that I appreciate their work, but also collections that in some cases are quite humble. I mean, they're not huge collections, they're interesting, but they're not those kind of collections that are very geeky or very kind of specific, in a sense that, they go from the beginning of to the end, because there are a lot of collections in the world, and more.
Well, they're not academic in that sense, but I would dispute that they're not geeky, because, you've got, I'm looking out here to Bernard Leach's pottery, which all came from the same Cornish pottery, and it's a particular type of pottery that Leach and his assistants made. There's also Michael Anastiades' stones, all of which are sort of improbably perfect in shape, in that they're circles and ovals. There are all the bricks, the wooden spoons. There's an obsessiveness there, which is very charmingly geeky, I think.
Yes, one of the other more obsessive than others. The brick collection is probably more obsessive, but people, most of the collections people live with. The pottery, Gem and Max, they live with us, but they use them. So they're not kind of the kind of mental piece, or the kind of, the vitrine, as you talked about, Haim, this vitrine hidden away to kind of show other people, what have I got, my nice collection of things. It's also, they're quite everyday kind of used as well. And for me, it was also important that these collections were inspirations for people that create, people who create culture and create objects. And so it was about somehow that kind of work that happens before someone actually designs something or creates something. So for me, that kind of, in that sense, what the texture of what is our world, be it in terms of its cultural context, be it about the materiality, be it about how they've been used, how they've been misused, how they've been kind of mended in some cases, manufacturing processes. So a lot of things that I think as a designer you somehow every day you're involved, with, and so that for me they're kind of hopefully inspirations for the people to create other work. So in that sense, to me, it's also about design, about creating possibilities for other work.
And you also explore a less benevolent vision of design in the films you've chosen, the René film and also Jacques Tati's Mon Oncle, and they're much more clinical, they're more consumerist. In many ways, they're a more stereotypical depiction of industrial design's influence on our lives. Why did you also include them?
Well, in this room where the work is actually shown, in the middle there's a huge table. And on this table I've collected all these catalogues from furniture manufacturers. And for me this is a library, somehow a library. People can come in and can look at furniture catalogues to show kind of a cross-section, what's actually out there in the world. Because a lot of time I think design is this kind of magic word that gets misused for all kinds of things. To sell a few more chairs or sell a few more other objects. So design is... It's also a really dirty word in a sense, used for all kinds of things. So I wanted to really just show not only the nice kind of collectible shelving units that surround us, that we all appreciate and we all would like somehow to have ourselves, but also what's really going on out there. I mean, anyone who's ever been to a design fair, realizes that there's 99% of stuff that we go like, wow, who designed this? Who makes this stuff? So for me, it was always about bringing that into a gallery space where you could kind of first of all look through this material. That again, it's also part of our culture. It's not that there's just good design and the rest is just we discard it, but it's also very much part of our culture. And so to have this kind of table, there's a lot of catalogs on that you can browse through, maybe even find some furniture because you may be looking for a chair or a table or something. But at the same time, you have those two movies that of two filmmakers who very early on kind of released a certain kind of future idea of design and put a critical kind of tone into that. Jacques Tati very much, in Playtime and in Mon Oncle, or a lot of his other movies, has always had this critical way of kind of questioning what happens to the modern world design. In Playtime is hilarious. How you kind of test these chairs and they make this sound, and so I think it's a very subtle kind of. Maybe in Tati it's less subtle, but maybe in Le Chant des Sirènes it's kind of. You're not quite sure if it's a documentary, is it a promotion, is it something that's advertisement, and sponsored by a big kind of plastic kind of producer. So for me, those two movies from a similar time, both of them French, because maybe France at that time is very advanced in plastic material and the future. So they kind of, they're very contemporary in a way for me. What's going on out there in the world, and people trying to sell us also objects that we maybe sometimes question.
And why did you call the show Design as a State of Mind?
The title initially was going to be called Short String, Long Wire, Keen Knife, and a title that nobody really would have understood either. But and one of the pieces out there will have these little boxes that are kind of fitting on top of each other. I have these little labels that I made for my studio, and I tried to, for my own sake, try to label my world. And they were kind of quite specific little, specific labels, because we all have this, when we clear up or we try to order our life, we end up with this kind of little mountain of stuff we don't quite sure where they belong to. So there is a short wire, a little bit of short wire, and a long string. Which drawer does it go through? So I made these labels, would go from strange shaped pasta to what's his name, because you don't have a name for it even. There's not even a name for a category. Or like books you're never going to read, or books you read. So it's kind of, I try to really every day kind of make these labels to someone understand how one could, kind of create categories for very personal use. And when Hans-Ulrich and Julia came to my studio, at one point I showed them those labels. And there was one short wire, long string. And the key knife came in afterwards because I really wanted to have a knife collection. Initially I was going to get a knife collection from Enzo Mari, because I knew he was a big knife collector, and so I went to Milan, met Enzo Mari, and he didn't give me his knife collection, but he gave me his paperweight collection.
Which are next door.
So for me, there was kind of a relationship in the short wire, the long string, and the key knife as how you would kind of describe objects. So back to the design as a state of mind. At one point, thinking about the relationship between these objects and what they do, I realized I'm very much interested in what these objects create in everyone's kind of mind, or kind of what kind of state do they kind of create rather than what they are. So for me, this exhibition was more about what kind of sense you can develop or create by looking at this rather than what I'm telling you to look at. And I think in that sense, it's for me not about dictating, but about kind of showing what's out there and what objects have been kind of influencing me, and hopefully a larger audience. So it's about the state of mind that it creates, rather than what I'm kind of telling you to kind of look at. And
Okay. And Haim, you also have a very intriguing title for your exhibition, and again, The World is Flat. Why did you choose that?
Yeah, once again, the world is flat because, the world a long time ago was not flat. We lived in a cave, and it was kind of rocky and irregular, and we began to invent tools, and one day, at a certain point, we moved towards the direction of what now we call architecture, and the floors are flat, and the streets are flat, and the tables are flat, and we stand on structures that we have made that are flat, that are not really what nature does. That's one way of talking about it. But anyway, once again, the world is flat is a found object. So it's a statement that I found in that typeset, not another typeset, in a magazine or a book. And I took it out, I tore that page out, put it in my file. So I collect this. And then at a certain point, I select one for whatever goes on in my mind at that point in time, and I reach for something that I need to make things fit. And once I do select it and decide to contextualize it in a show or somewhere, it becomes an object that could also be a work of art. So it's a found object, it's a work of art. So it's the original typeset, and then it could be put into vinyl lettering, and it could be small or big. So it becomes a wall piece or wall text, and that's the work. If you have that work, you have the instructions, and you can go and have it made tiny and put it above your light switch in the bathroom, or you can make it big, put it above your sofa in the living room. And so once again, the world is flat I found that in the 80s at some point, and it kept recurring. Sometimes I would sign in a book, and I would write, once again, the world is flat, a book that I would give somebody. It's only recently that it ended up being, it came to be, it's, again, like I said, it's like the vocabulary that you have, and you're in a certain train of thought at a certain point, and you decide to do a certain show, and you decide to calibrate, the pieces so as to communicate to the work in a way that it would hopefully be read differently and seen for something that it really is more than all the things that are being blown up. And that just seemed right. And at a certain point, it just became. And then I decided that would be could be the statement for the show, or the title for the show. As what's the title anyway? It's a logo. It's a sign. It's a poem. It's some kind of an indicator towards a direction of thinking.
But if you have a title, better to have a wonderful aphorism like that, which is open to so many interpretations. It's also the choice of the word flat is very interesting, because I wondered how engaged you are with the theory of flatness, which is something that a lot of young artists, particularly artists who work digitally, are very involved with at the moment. And all similarly within product design, there's a new theory of flat design, an aesthetic of flat design that relates specifically to the future design of user interfaces on phones and other digital devices. Were you referring to that at all, or is it entirely coincidental?
I don't think it's entirely coincidental, but I was not referring to that in any kind of intellectualized way. I can say that, for instance, again, artists, musicians, composers, they reconfigure the language. And it has to do with being in the context of the culture and being attuned to change. And you begin to see certain things, and you try to, you're a conduit, to put it into a form, what we call form. And once that form is identified, through other responses as being an indicative of of meaning, then it has a currency, then it functions. I think the digital, what happens today when you work on the screen digitally, you can go and pick a painting out of a museum and throw it next to a pot or a toilet cleaner or whatever you want to throw together. You can mix it however you want to, and everybody does that, People throw in ideas and they get mixed with other people's ideas, and it gets back to the question that you asked me earlier. So when you take an object from the museum or someplace, do you have that was chosen or placed in the museum by curators, by a whole institution of high priests and priests and so on, that protect and preserve and give meaning to these things. I heard you as, in a way, saying, well, do you engage these meanings? Does that have a specific meaning that's different than a cup, that's on your shelf in the kitchen? And I said, no, it doesn't, because these things already are talking. They're already complete inventions. That's maybe the flatness. But anyway, I don't know if that connects with what you were asking me, but
it does beautifully.
It's okay.
Given that collections and collecting is such an important theme of both your exhibitions, could we talk about that for a moment? And Haim, what is it about collections that engages you so acutely?
Well, I'm really not engaged by collections, although collections are very important to take note of, because people collect. And, when I was in junior high school or high school, I read Tennessee Williams, I think it was Tennessee Williams, The Glass Menagerie, about this young woman who was collecting all these glass. It was a very romantic story, so I was kind of seduced by the story, I suppose, at that point in time in my life. But I think it had an effect on me. I never think about it, it's like years later, suddenly I realize, I read that book way back there, what did that mean? Some people specifically collect certain things, like stamps. We used to collect stamps when we were kids. Every time a new stamp came out, and we had a book with stamps, and so these are really typologies. It also has to do with having something specifically that takes an interest of yours. It could be a study. So a collection could also be a botanist, working with butterflies and, the cocoons and seeing them grow and, and having a collection of butterflies. So I think a collection is a kind of a way that individuals are trying to focus on a specific group of things, to understand them better, to appreciate them, and to see those slight differences. So they're kind of magical, fascinating things also. But I'm not interested in collections. I was interested in objects that people have. And as I said before, that's part of their collection. You go into a home, and, as a child, I was very kind of aware of that I would go to a friend's home. The family was from Persia, and they had rugs on the wall, and I was just fascinated by that. And that was a collection. It was a cultural, ethnic group of objects, of materials that is of that culture. That's already a collection. So I'm not interested in collections. I'm interested in the relativeness of objects from different collections. And it's a kind of a relational play, a relative, say, a comparative play. In the before the 60s, there was hardly a department in the university called comparative literature. In the 60s, suddenly there was a new department, comparative literature. Before that, you studied a particular literature and you focused on that: German literature, English literature, Eskimo literature, whatever. And then then they have this department, comparative literature. Today we talk about interdisciplinary practices, multicultural and global, right? Global is just the last 15 years. I mean, In the 80s, nobody talked about global anything, you know. It was just not that long ago for me. In the 90s, kind of vaguely, it's in the 2000s that everything, and also you can see what's happened, you know, in terms of the. So, you know, what interests me about collections in the end, and I did a show in 2000 at the Neue Berliner Kunstverein and the Haus der Kunst, in which I, with a guide and with, you know, discussing before, engaged people from different parts of Berlin and then later on Munich and asked them to let us borrow some objects from their house. And some people had a collection. This one old, 80-year-old man, when he was a young man, he was in Shanghai, and he had a collection of Chinese objects, and he had them in his living room like a shrine. And I borrowed all those objects and placed them on a shelf more or less in the same order, but in completely different. It was also a scaffolding situation. So, so I had these different collections. I had a collection. I went to a 13-year-old girl's room, and when I went to her house, and you know, I said, well, let's you know, engage some younger people, and she had images from magazines, you know, like a man and a woman, so kind of fashionable, you know, with the look, the gaze, and all that, and other things on her wall. And I said, let's just take all of this and then put them in the show. And we discussed it, and then she thought it was really interesting. She wanted, and then we discussed how we should show them. But what is interesting about collections is that you see, since the late 80s, it all started in the late 80s, you see artists getting collections of things, and sometimes en masse, huge, and bringing them into the museum. I think maybe that could be a point of answering your question. I wonder, what is that about?
What do you think it is about?
Well, there are many sides. One thing that it's about is I want to enter the discussion, and I'm thinking about it. Like I said, in my earlier work, I was entering the minimal discussion. I wasn't doing minimal art in the 60s, but by 1968, I was aware that artists were doing this kind of work, and I was, you know, found it very engaging, and I tried to understand it. So it incorporated it into my own practice as a way to sorting out and getting to understand it in context of other things I've learned before. So you're asking questions. What is it about? They're asking questions. What does it mean to do this? And I want to do this too. One of the answers is, hey, let's do it bigger. Let's have 1 million toothbrushes in the room, you know. And suddenly you saw, by the beginning of the 90s, artists doing, I would walk into a museum and say, you never saw this stuff before. A room full of objects. Mike Kelly, who was not doing this in the early 80s, you know, and was not doing this in the late 80s, and Mike is a great artist, so he was doing his own thing, also entered that discussion. And by 93 at Sonsbeek, he curated a show called The Uncanny, and he had a room full of endless collections of magazines, you know, pop magazines, tables full of toothbrushes and other objects. And it's you know, so I think it's about engaging in the idea of, you know, the typologies of these objects, the quantity, what are all these objects about? You know, everybody has one of these, and if you get everybody's object, everybody's salt and pepper shaker, you know, what do you got? You know, what do we see?
So, Martino, for you, do collections have a similar appeal, or are you also focused on the psychology of the collector and the sort of narrative behind the collection?
Well, I mean, for me, without collections, there would be no show, basically. Do you know what I mean? Talking about, if you want to do a show about design, you're going to have to find some objects. I mean, it's not, you know, it won't be a conceptual show. You know, it's maybe an art show where you have a conceptual, you know, you can say, I'm not going to show anything, that's my conceptual work. But if you want to talk about design, you're going to have to choose some objects. You know, you can get them from a museum, you can get them from, you can make them yourself, you can get someone into the gallery, make them while you know, the show is on. So at one point I realized, of course, I needed a display, as I talked earlier on, I needed a display, and I wanted to use design as a display. But I also wanted to have objects, and those objects are really important because they were kind of the carriers and the kind of the medium to talk about how what design has made, what design is making, and what obviously these designers with their private collections have been collecting, because for me that gave me an insight of how they work, how they operate, how they think. And for me it was probably as important to show them was actually to go and see them. I mean, as I said, I went to Milan, I went to a lot of people's studios and houses to have a conversation, and they asked me, so why me? Why should I'm not really a collector. And I said, well, look around you, I mean, it's full. Let's have a conversation about this piece, you tell me something. And then, so it was kind of also dialogue, and I think that's for me as important. Obviously, it's not shown in the exhibition, but for me as a designer, it was important to have this conversation about these artifacts that are somehow placeholders for people's kind of interest and people's kind of inspiration and people's kind of way of interacting with the world.
Is it also a sort of shortcut to intimacy? Because there is something deeply personal about the choice of collection, the assiduousness with which the individual pursues it. They're making themselves rather vulnerable in a way by showing it, something that's so special to them that they care about so much, and that they will have largely been a private undertaking.
Oh, for sure, yeah, it was very private. I mean, and people are very worried about, how they're going to be displayed. Not so much who next to you, but what on, and am I going to get them back, and what if they disappear, So there was also kind of this kind of conversation going on. But for me, they were kind of statements, obviously statements about what the world has been occupying itself with, and what industry has been kind of manufacturing in the good, the bad, and the ugly in a way, and what kind of objects kind of surround us. So for me, they're kind of little snapshots of different times of design, different kind of individuals who again have interfered with that and collected this. Yeah.
And one of the things that fascinates me about collecting is the pathology of it, the sort of absolute extremism, and also the notion that it's sort of akin to having an insatiable appetite. If I was the richest woman in the world, I couldn't possibly buy all the art I would personally desire to own. It would be unavailable. I could never, however much money I had, it would never be enough. Seth Siegerlaub, the textile collector, said that one of the reasons he'd chosen textiles was because it was completely crazy and self-defeating. They were crazy things to collect. They can't be conserved efficiently. They rot. They attract moths, and so on. So eventually they perish. Is that a side of collecting that appeals to you, or am I being too soap operatic?
It definitely appeals to me. The psychology, the anxiety about somebody taking a piece off. I mean, with my work, you really have a group of objects sitting on a shelf, and they're not glued to the shelf. And when the show is over, or when you're moving, you put the shelf into a box, and you put the object into another box. And then I give instructions how to place the objects, but that's just one way of doing it. It doesn't happen that way once in the house, because somebody cleans the dust a little bit, they don't look at the instructions, they put it back the way they remember it, and so on. So the pathology or the psychology of objects is just full of anxiety, love, hate, and that's very, very important. I mean, that's very much on my mind.
There's a wonderful example out there, which is the bricks collected by the graphic designer Maki Suzuki, a great friend of Martino's, and you said that he collects them when he travels. So I had this brilliant image of him staggering onto planes with bricks in his carry-on baggage, trying to disguise them. I mean, that struck me as a wonderful example of deeply eccentric collecting.
Well, this collection is actually given to him by a assistant of Carl Andre.
So
while traveling. So, yeah.
So not quite that.
Yeah.
Haim, you talked earlier about what happens to an object when it's recontextualized. So taking an object and putting it in an art institution like the Serpentine in the context of an art exhibition. Can we talk about classification and what happens to that object in terms of the way it will be perceived?
Well, if you want to talk about classification, of course, that's a structural thing, and it's also a mental and a thinking situation. It's structuring and it's thinking. So it's a particular kind of structuring and thinking. And of course, as I said earlier, that museums classify, and collectors classify. They choose to classify by the fact that they are collecting a certain kind of objects, and those objects may have a class. They may be a very special group of objects of a certain kind, different, but of a certain craft or quality that they're seeking. And so they're already classifying them by a particular choice. Like you collect contemporary art or you collect Renaissance art, because that's your love, and you can afford it, so you go for it. But that's one kind of thinking. And I think the everyday experience that we have with objects doesn't classify except the way that we classify, and it's part of our intuitive way of projecting our own experiences and selectivity. So when we go to a museum and there's so much to see, we pass on a lot of things. And then we focus on something, and then something maybe surprises us, something that we already had a little bit of a thought sometimes before, and there it is again. And repetition has a lot to do with suddenly stopping. An artist, a London artist, I'm not going to mention the name just because I want to, I don't think it's embarrassing, but said to me the other day, she saw this show at the Hessel Museum, and she saw this one shelf that has the nurse that looks like a frog on top of, and she said, that was not at the Hessel Museum, was it? And I said, yes, it was. She said, that's a great work. How come I didn't see it? Are you sure it was there? I said, yes. So what happens is that you pass over things. But I said to her, well, you already recognized it there, but it's now you really saw it. It's a change of context that maybe made it possible. There it was a very different place, in a particular corner, and there was a big cabinet full of things. So the other side, it was the back of the cabinet, which is just the closed side of the cabinet. Context is very important in terms of awareness and inspiration. When something that you have a relationship with and it's already fixed with meaning and connections within a context in your own thinking, and it's in another place. In the 80s, artists used to organize shows in New York City. You don't see it that much anymore. And they engaged different artists, and they would go and take a dilapidated old factory in a part of Brooklyn in New York City that was abandoned. They would engage the owner. They'll give you money, they'll get the funding, just to do a show for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then they would send a call, anybody. There was a show called The Monumental. And you saw Leon Golub there and Alice Neal and all kinds of artists you've known in that context, and it just looked like all the other art, It just lost that aura of the special wall and so on. And then you said, is this an Alice? Yeah. It looks like, you engage, suddenly questions come up, So when you go to the museum, and it's already important, it's total transformation, When this work of mine is in the museum, it hasn't been shown for 30 years. Nobody was interested in it, Somebody will say, somebody wants to buy a work, Nobody was interested in it. The work is the work. The object is the object. It's all in it. It suddenly changes context in a certain situation, suddenly become over. It's there.
So really, the nature of classification is really rooted in perception and how different some people might see, say, a shelf with 3
and the other way
tools
around.
on it.
Perception is rooted in classification.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
Indeed. So Martino, if I ask you the same question, but to a different purpose, in terms of making work, what differentiates an artist from a designer? I mean, we have the new genre of conceptual or critical designers who use their work in the way to critique changes in contemporary culture in the way that artists have traditionally done. What would make their work design rather than art?
I think we're going to be here a long time to discuss what about art design, yeah. I think something interesting that Haim said, like the way that when he gives instructions, he has, shows of work or, gives it to a museum or someone buys it, he will give instruction how to, the work is kind of shown and the context is shown. I think that's, for me, I think where there is a difference in terms of design, because a designer, when you sell something, it's totally up to the owner, the user, to do whatever they want to do with it. You have there's no more control over that. It's left your kind of the arena in a way. So in that sense, I would say it's kind of when there is, you can give instruction, but someone say, I want to have it this way, and that's the way it is, you're going to use it. So in a way you kind of, at some point it stops being kind of your work and it becomes someone else's kind of object they live with. That's for me kind of one of many, many different kind of ways of explaining what the difference is.
But there's a contradiction here. The contradiction is that if you see a work of mine in a picture in a book, and you see the objects arranged in that way that I prescribed, this is how you remember the work. But when you see it in a museum and an object has been turned to the side because somebody touched it, the guard hasn't paid attention, and the curator hasn't come by to check it, some people get disturbed. If they know the work, they say, oh, that doesn't look good. What happened? They still have the picture, in the classification of the art book, embedded in their head. So my instructions are, in a way, the way you have instructions how to play chess. You start and all the pieces are in one place, and they're ready to be played with. And once the game begins, they move. So my work does apply to the function you're talking about, because just like the table, it's a table that's already set. But the people who have it, they come to eat. And then the plates and the forks suddenly are moved around. So on the one hand, I understand what you're saying, but on the other hand, I think that in the case of my work, it doesn't really work that way. It is really, the functional aspect is what people overlook, because it is already set to be in a functional situation. And it depends on the collector, whether they want to organize it and make sure nobody touches it, or they have somebody who watches when there is a party that nobody would put an ashtray on there or a glass, with water or something, or a lien on the shelf. Or whether they just want to keep it in the case, and wait until the value goes up.
Well, that's again, then once it comes out of the box, then there will be this instruction. But yeah, I think for me, it's also that I think that's interesting. When I was studying at the Royal College, I was kind of interested in the shelves, because for me, it suddenly was an artist who reversed, in a way, the concept of the shelf was the piece of art in a way, and the objects on top of it was something that obviously was a part of a collection you found. So that was the given in a way. So in a way, you turn this concept upside down. And I think that was interesting to me as a designer, in a sense of, when suddenly you kind of swap things around. I think in terms of what it means between the design art kind of conversation, I think is that when you make design objects, a lot of times, I work with artists. My wife is an artist. I make plinths for her sculptures because she doesn't like to design the plinth, so I make the plinth. It's her art piece. But I think when design becomes somehow the functional part of an overall work that someone has to make, because otherwise you're not going to be showing certain art pieces, because they need plinths, they need the structure. So that's something interesting as well. I think when I think design can be also working alongside art, and be a collaboration in a sense. Even though the artist will be credited for the artwork, I think in that sense it becomes an applied way of applied art. I think it's an interesting concept, I think, for me. It's not just about, okay, there's the art, here's a hierarchy, and then there comes the design, and then becomes the craft, and then it goes in this kind of line. For me, it's interesting when these two can work together to create something that can only work because people work together, in a sense, and is displayed in a certain way.
So if we take the example of this table which Martino made, which we are currently using as a functional table with our glasses on it and so on, is there any context in which it could be a work of art?
Well, everything is a work of art. So if you see something and you think it's beautiful and you love it, and that's your standard for a work of art, it's beautiful, then it's a work of art.
But that's a very limited definition of a work of art, simply that something's beautiful.
Well, the difference, anything can be beautiful or ugly. It really depends on what you project and bring to it. I think that getting back to the issue of relativity, and this is why we have this discussion today at this point in time, and there are the shifts in practices, where designer plays the role of the artist plays the role of designer. You can be a designer and an artist and a designer. It's what is the difference? The difference is that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has all the costume designs in one space, and they don't put it next to the Matisse or the Cézanne, and next to a sofa in the same room. The objects are segregated, and then their value is within a certain set of standards of values that deem those dresses to be either their period, exquisite or excellent examples of that period dress, or table. I think that Courvoisier daybed or Mies van der Rohe daybed or these are remarkable works of art. There is a Geoponti piece there on the wall that Martino had chosen and placed that it really looks like minimal art. In a sense, it's a very minimal art. It's a remarkable work, and he was doing this in 1953. So I said, well, that's what Kelly was doing, this kind of work in 1953. Did the guys know each other? Most likely not. So where does it come from? It's in the culture. It comes out, of course, modernism and so on, and some questions that are raised about, if you're going to look at a Mondrian that's on the wall that's divided in a certain way, it's, how do you assess those relationships and question them and try to work with another set of relationships to deal with this relief, if you're interested in relief object? Why isn't the Geoponti in the same room with Carl Andre and Donald Judd,
Well, isn't there another question?
Or Robert Ryman or Robert Mangold, there it is, it's 1953, it precedes all these people. And so were the early Kellys. Even there, it's minimal art. Ellsworth Kelly is, precedes in the history book minimal art, so in the art book, So I think that, I don't know.
But do you think there would be any value in the Geoponti being surrounded by those artworks?
There'll be value in the way that they talk to each other in a different way.
So in other words, it could be an interesting relationship between the objects.
Yeah. And, this beautiful table, and I can see that it's in discussion with, in a certain way, with Prouvé, for instance, and what an interesting way of engaging in that discussion. And so it's in the form. If something is captured in the work that transcends the object itself, but is in the object, eventually it becomes a work of art, because it becomes a paradigm, it becomes exemplary, because it inspires other people to think in a new way. That's what a work of art is. It breaks a new ground, it raises a new awareness. If it is remarkably well done, beautiful, intelligent, all this, but it's still couched within the category of that other discussion, then it will have a place of value, but it may not get to this other plateau of discourse. It would not become a paradigm. So I think works of art, they're different levels, and there are a lot of good art, if John Cage tried to compose like Schoenberg, with whom he studied, and followed Schoenberg's, criticism of his own work, or an appreciation too, but also criticism, he would have never become John Cage. Somehow he was able to understand structure and recalibrate, And, I think that's a work of art ultimately is in the vision, in the thinking.
Martino, one final question for you before we open it up. My impression as somebody who writes about design rather than tackling the much more difficult task of actually doing it is that traditionally there was a great deal of paranoia in the design world about hierarchies of disciplines, and there was what to me was a fairly tedious tendency of some designers to want to kind of reinvent themselves as artists, which I always felt was belittling to design. It now strikes me that that tendency is far less pronounced, and that design is seen as a much freer, more inclusive, more eclectic discipline, and so younger designers are far less exercised than that. Do you think that's true?
Surely. A lot of these pieces of design that we see in the shelvings, designed by Italian architects. Not too long ago in Italy, you couldn't even study design. It's about 15, 20 years ago that you can actually design as you were studying architecture. Even though it's a place that everyone talks about design, but you had to study architecture to be a designer in a way. So these are people who designed houses, and in that sense, it was a very prescriptive kind of way of how you kind of came to design. While at some point, people realized, well, maybe you don't necessarily have to be an architect to be a designer, and you can make things with your hand, you can experiment. I think London had a lot of this kind of attitude as well back in the 80s, where people just take a bit of steel and weld something together and created objects that obviously worked as pieces of design. So I think the discipline itself opened itself. It's a fairly new discipline, design, in a sense, even though we always talk about, the Bauhaus, and earlier on we talk about, it's probably thousands of years old in the sense of creating objects, but the idea of this design is a very new.
Well, the idea of design isn't new, but the idea of the professional designer
that's called a job description, is a very new one, and therefore, I think at one point, I think it was very prescriptive. I think you had to behave, do a certain type of design. You had to kind of come to a result in a certain way. You had a piece of paper, you did the drawings, you showed it to someone, you convinced someone that this was a good design, and therefore then they would manufacture something. And there was always a need at some point for mass-manufactured items, so you would then obviously find the right industrialist, the right company to do that. Anything else was craft. Anything else was kind of, the artisan in his kind of workshop, making a one-off piece, more or less, even though if you. So I think this has somehow changed, because designers can do one-off pieces, they can do work for the industry, they can do commissions. So I think this opened somehow, and I think it opened for many different reasons, because there was no one subscribing somehow what do you have to be as a designer. And I feel like my practice, a lot of the time what I do is actually designing my own practice. So it's actually thinking about how I want to engage in design, And I think you're very lucky as a designer, and I think maybe the same is to artists as well, that as an artist, you also you create your own practice. So it's not that you have to behave as there are certain kind of unwritten kind of scenarios how you could behave as an artist, But I think that's the great thing about art and design, that you create your own practice, and this is as much part of your work as the actually object itself, and what you want to communicate to the outside world through objects, through kind of, And I think that's for me really what kind of I think what the shift in the way happened, where designers somehow realized yes, they could do it very much their own way, and they didn't have to work for Capellini or some other companies to be a designer. They could create with their own hands. They could be very good in operating computer or software, or do a bit of mix of that.
Okay. Now we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience, and a hand has gone up straight away because we started late, so we'll run on for an extra 10 minutes or so.
I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about the pleasures, the seductions of taste, or indifference as pleasure or seduction, and so it was mainly about seduction, pleasure, taste, and indifference. Taste seems to be very important.
Haim, do you want to start off?
Good taste and bad taste, right? So, it's all the same. It depends on the individual, or it depends on the group that establishes what it is. You can talk forever about that. But I think taste it's a way of thinking and selecting. And in order to think, we need to select. And once we select, we can identify relationships within a certain focus. And once we get that focus, we may, appreciate it. When you go and you learn a new subject, you don't quite understand what's going on. You don't understand the language, so you have to learn the ABC. Once you get it and you know it, you can sing with it, It just flows. And you identify in it. And it's got good things because it's been structured, and you can do something with it. So, we can talk forever about this, but it's a formed, it's a formed point of view, and it's a selective point of view, taste. And if you wholly identify with it and cannot tolerate or open up to other tastes or even consider them, then you've formed your point of view. And sometimes, we do need to form our point of views, to build on something and to specialize. You can't play the drums, the marimbas, the cello, and the violin and become a master violinist. Maybe you can, maybe somebody can, maybe become a very ingenious, abstract, and new composer. For the violin, writing pieces for the violin. But if you can, then you do it.
Martino?
I would agree with that. But I also think taste is a lot about language as well. I mean, it's how what you surround yourself with. I think it's changing. It's not something that once you have good taste, that's it. It's something that shifts. I think it's interesting you asking me this, because we actually got one of your paintings in our house. It's quite big, and I wasn't so convinced at the beginning, but now I couldn't live without it. And it's because taste is something that shifts. You need time to spend time with objects, to appreciate their kind of beauty or their kind of And thanks God it's a shifting thing, because if you'd be very static, we'd be always stuck in this world where, once you choose some kind of a taste, you kind of locked into that. It'd be a very horrible world. So I think it's also nice, the older we get, or older, every now and then we kind of try to introduce new kind of senses of taste. So it's interesting, in German they say Geschmackslos for bad taste, and that actually means without any taste. So there might be like certain objects that are good taste, bad taste, and even without taste. I think that's even the worst category of all of them. It's like
it's indifferent.
It's like there's good taste that at one point changes because bad taste becomes good taste, but there's just a kind of a thing. I'm more worried about this world where there is just no taste, with kind of the flatness in the sense where you're like, wow, who made this? It's just like not even there. It's like it doesn't even come to the surface of, I don't know.
Duchamp conceptualized and repeated that he's not really working in the territory of taste. But, he was quite a sophisticated aesthete, Duchamp, despite of this. But he was, very clever in just holding that ground, i.e. saying that, he was not into taste. And in a certain way, he was not, because he stepped out of a certain territory of canons and rules and didn't play by the rules. When you do that, you go to the desert, like Jesus Christ went to the desert, You find yourself, At that point, you are tasteless. You've given up. You've pulled yourself away. And, if you pull yourself away too far, you can get lost. And people experience that, and then they go back, where they feel comfortable. But if you challenge yourself and if you can sustain, being lost for some time without going crazy, you may find another route.
So one more question?
Not taste related.
Okay, well, as one final question, as objects has been the defining theme of both exhibitions, it seems to me that in terms of object culture, we're at a particularly interesting time where, because of digital technology, the kind of objects we use every day are changing very rapidly and very dramatically. I mean, we're engaging with technologies that would have seemed like the stuff of science fiction film only a few years ago, and yet many once familiar objects are gradually disappearing, whether it's a printed road atlas or an alarm clock or whatever. Do you feel that this will have an impact on the way you treat objects in your work, Haim?
No, because we still have 2 feet and 2 hands and 1 head, and we can't turn our head 360 degrees around to see what's behind us. We still need the flatness of the table to eat and to function well. What if I see that, Martino is exploring, these different shifts in the table by creating angles. This person is going to have a curve where they sit. This person may be in between two. What if this table was like a table, a normal table, but this part was only 1 foot from the ground, and this part was 15 feet from the ground, and that part, and we all sat around it, It would be a very different way of relating, One person would be sitting on a high chair up there, eating up there, you'd be sitting here, Yes, well, how is it you like it, We still, so there is a common denominator. We need to put the water in a glass. This is going to happen when we will be all genetically transformed. And, the computer chip would be in our head, and I'll think, run. And I'll run, but I'll think run faster. And I'll be able to run faster than a human being can run, because it would somehow send the messages, and there'll be other kind of coordinates that will be motorized, and suddenly I'll be running faster, So, we talk about transformation. that of the physical world that I don't think are going to happen very soon. But in terms of perception and how we communicate, that's the psychological side of it. Yeah, I think it's really radicalizing. And, with the screens and the computers and the education that, the world that the younger generation of kids are plugged into, it's just phenomenal.
So, Martino, if I ask you also about the impact of digital technology on your work as a product designer, and now there's a massive debate about digital manufacturing technologies like 3D printing and the implications they're going to have for not only design but the objects people use, the possibility of consumers and users personalizing more and more objects in their lives, but also the possibility of a transformation in our approach towards repairs, for example. I mean, do you find that digital production scenario enticing, alluring, terrifying, somewhere in the middle?
I think it reminds me a little bit of the Jacques Tati movie, Mon Oncle. When someone tries to, obviously, an industry behind tries to sell you something, and they always paint this world where everything is like, everything is going to be perfect. It's this perfect world, and we also obviously we all like what we all like. Some people more than others like the idea of the perfect world. There's no more problems, but we realize then we're still going to have objects. It's look different. It's not that we actually changing we change the use a little bit, but we still are attached to our objects. So I find a lot of the time it makes me smile a little bit when I hear this kind of design is changing because you can print anything 3D now, and it's true, but at the same time, I mean, I studied across the road to the Royal College, and I taught there. And when we got the first 3D printer, I mean, students started printing the most banal objects on this printer. And you go like, it was amazing technology, but you print the most banal object that you could just go in a workshop and cut a piece of wood and make it. It's a bit like, I don't know, when desktop publishing came out, you could suddenly, Photoshop or whatever, people started doing the most kind of weirdest kind of collages that you could do much more beautiful, maybe by just cutting out, So I think there's this kind of idea that, you can do it so much better and it'd be amazing. But I think what I'm missing a lot of time with this technology is actually the combination, and I think that's what you said about repair. When this technology is really like used as a tool rather than as the new world, the new media, when you use it, I mean, I've done a few projects where I used kind of an extrusion, aluminum extrusion that was industrially produced with a rapid prototype, rapid manufacturing printing technique to make a light holder. Then we had a tube, just a metal tube, and we had a way to customizing where the lamp was going to be fitted on. So it was like 3 types of technologies kind of together, like industry, handcrafted, and 3D printing. I think that's when it becomes interesting to me, when you can insert it into traditional kind of ways of manufacturing, and it just gives you now and then this advantage to be able to do something, one piece in a specific material that is actually a working material. It's printed in nylon, or it's printed in metal or ceramic. So I think I find it interesting there, but to think that the whole world is going to be like, I don't know, it's kind of makes me smile because I kind of seen, even though I'm young, I've seen a few of those technologies around, and you realize.
You think Jacques Tati
would make a nice movie with this again, and but I'm sure, it's changing, and there's an amazing, there's actually one object in the show that actually quickly talk about. It's actually a typewriter printing head. And this was an amazing leap in terms of typewriters, when from this kind of simple typewriter with those sticks that would hit the paper, it became a round head that was working on 3-dimensional...
The golf ball.
Golf ball, in a way. This was actually the first kind of 3-dimensional printing in a way, because suddenly that machine had a 360-degree, kind of movement. So, I think it's interesting when this technology can inform other kind of ways of thinking and making things.
But in the end, all those letters that come out of this 3-dimensional object have to fall on the line. Yeah. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to follow it. You know, they can't just go all over the place, and we still have not caught up with that kind of cross-referencing of letters, you know, to see more complex meanings and words. We still need that structure. So.
Is it too late to ask about the role of sculpture?
About what?
The role of sculpture.
What kind of sculpture?
The role of sculpture. So, well, what's your question?
About the role of sculpture within your work.
You know, people call it sculpture, and it comes out in sculptures, you know, Sculpture Now or something like that. Of course, you know, this is sculpture. It could be a monument, you know, in the piazza, you know, that's, 10 meters, let's say 100 meters tall, you know, and, you know, with shooting water that comes all the way down into a huge pond, you know. No one has made that sculpture yet. You know? It could be just glass. That's what I see. It's working right now. I see the water coming out. You know, the scale here, this is like a big piece of land. You know, it's like pretty big, you know. Little Giacometti figures, you know, walking around. And this is a sculpture. Some artists do make big objects, big tables and so on, and, you know, objects are sculpture. You know, a design is sculpture. A designer makes sculpture. This table is sculpture. You can talk in terms of how it functions in space, but also the spaces in it. My eye goes from the top into the space between the two parts of the leg on each side. And I cannot avoid seeing that space. I see the floor running through that whenever my eye shifts that way and it moves around it. That's sculpture. So sculpture is in the eye of the, of the beholder, yes. And we project sculpture onto things. Sculpture is the experience of three-dimensional space. Sculpture is objects, sculpture, you know, architecture. It's how these things are in space. And so that's what sculpture is to me.
Well, if you have any more questions, you'll have to be quick and nab Martino and Haim afterwards. I would like to thank them very much for coming here this evening and also to congratulate them heartily on your exhibitions. They're both fantastic. It's lovely to think we can see them in London for over the next month or so. So thank you very much for bringing them here, and thank you to all of you for coming, and to the Serpentine.
And thank you.